September 15, 1945. The acrid smoke of Tokyo's destruction still hung in the morning air like a shroud over the dying empire. In the shadow of the imperial palace, where cherry blossoms once bloomed in peaceful springs, now stood the skeletal remains of what had been Kamagome Infectious Disease Hospital. The war was over, but death lingered in the corridors like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Nurse Kimura Sachiko moved through the half-destroyed ward with practiced silence, her white uniform stained with blood and desperation. The fabric, once pristine as fresh snow on Mount Fuji, now bore the marks of 3 years of impossible choices. In her weathered hands she carried a small ceramic bowl containing the last precious grains of rice from the hospital's dwindling stores. Each grain was counted, each portion measured with the precision of a tea ceremony master, for this was all that stood between her patients and starvation. The morning light, filtered through broken windows and falling debris, cast long shadows across beds filled with the forgotten casualties of a collapsing empire. These were not the glorious warriors of propaganda posters, but hollow-eyed men whose bodies bore the testament of a war that had consumed everything: their strength, their hope, their very humanity. In the corner bed lay Lieutenant Tanaka, his left leg a mangled reminder of Iwo Jima, infection spreading through his veins like poison through water. Beside him, Corporal Yamada clutched his stomach, dysentery slowly draining what little life remained in his 20-year-old frame. Sachiko had worked in this hospital since 1942. When victory seemed as certain as the rising sun, she had believed, as they all had believed, in the invincibility of the divine empire. She had believed that Japanese spirit, pure and unwavering, would triumph over American materialism and weakness. She had believed that their soldiers, trained in the way of Bushido, fed on discipline and honor, would never yield to an enemy grown soft on abundance and comfort. But belief, like rice, had grown scarce in the final months of war. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hospital's broken halls, not the familiar shuffle of Japanese military boots, but the heavy rhythmic march of foreign soldiers. Sachiko's heart quickened, not with fear but with a deeper uncertainty that had no name. For months they had been told stories of the coming American occupation, tales of brutal conquerors who would show no mercy to the defeated, who would take revenge for Pearl Harbor with interest compounded in blood and suffering. Through the hospital's main entrance came a sight that defied every expectation, every carefully constructed narrative of the enemy. A column of American soldiers, led by a tall captain with kind eyes and dust-covered boots, carried not weapons of destruction, but wooden crates marked with red crosses. Behind them, medics wheeled stretchers loaded not with wounded Americans, but with supplies, more medical supplies than Sachiko had seen in the past 2 years combined. Captain William Harrison, 34th Medical Battalion, had entered hundreds of field hospitals across the Pacific. He had seen the aftermath of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Okinawa. He had held dying Marines in his arms and performed surgery with bullets whistling overhead. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, walking into a hospital where the enemy had become simply human beings in need of healing. The Japanese medical staff, led by Dr. Watanabe, gathered in the main corridor with the rigid formality that even defeat could not entirely strip away. They bowed deeply, their movements precise despite their exhaustion, expecting the harsh commands of military occupation. Instead, Captain Harrison removed his helmet and bowed in return, a gesture so unexpected that several nurses gasped audibly. "We're here to help," Harrison said in carefully practiced Japanese, his pronunciation imperfect but his intention unmistakable. The words hung in the air like incense, unfamiliar and almost impossible to comprehend. What followed shattered every assumption Sachiko had carried about the nature of war, the character of enemies, and the meaning of victory itself. The American soldiers began unloading their crates with methodical efficiency, but also with something Sachiko had never witnessed in 3 years of military service. They smiled. Not the grim smiles of men drunk on conquest, but the genuine expressions of people genuinely glad to be helping. Private Rodriguez, a medic from New Mexico, began organizing supplies with the same care he might have shown in an American field hospital. Sergeant Murphy, whose own brother had died at Bataan, handed boxes of sulfa packets to Japanese orderlies without hesitation or reservation. But it was the supplies, themselves that truly stunned the Japanese medical staff into silence. From the wooden crates emerged an abundance that seemed almost mythical. Bottles of penicillin, the miracle drug that most Japanese physicians had only heard whispered about in medical journals. Boxes upon boxes of sulfa packets enough to treat hundreds of infections, morphine vials by the dozens, promising relief from pain that had become a constant companion to the wounded and dying. Surgical instruments gleaming with machine precision, bandages white as fresh snow, and bottles of plasma that could literally pour life back into emptied veins. Dr. Watanabe, who had been rationing single aspirin tablets for weeks, stood transfixed before a crate containing more pain medication than his hospital had possessed in 6 months. His hands trembled as he lifted a bottle of precious penicillin, reading and rereading the label as if it might vanish like a mirage. This is all for us?" he asked in broken English, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Harrison nodded. "For your patients. For healing." The transformation that followed was not just medical but philosophical. As American medics worked alongside Japanese nurses, sharing techniques and comparing treatment methods, the artificial barriers of nationality began to dissolve. Language became secondary to the universal vocabulary of compassion. When Private Chen, a Chinese-American medic, showed Nurse Sachiko how to properly administer the new antibiotics, she found herself learning not just medical procedures, but witnessing a radically different approach to warfare's aftermath. The sulfa packets became, in those first days of occupation, more than mere medicine. They became symbols of a worldview that Sachiko had never imagined possible. Each small yellow envelope contained not just sulfanilamide powder, but a philosophy of abundance over scarcity, cooperation over conquest, healing over revenge. She watched in amazement as American soldiers, who should have been their enemies, worked 12-hour shifts treating Japanese patients with the same dedication they showed their own wounded. She saw Captain Harrison personally carry Lieutenant Tanaka to the operating room, this American officer cradling a Japanese soldier who had likely shot at Americans just months before. She witnessed Sergeant Murphy, whose brother's death at Bataan should have filled him with hatred, patiently teaching Japanese orderlies how to set up plasma transfusions. The contrast with Japanese military culture was stark and undeniable. In the Imperial Army, resources were hoarded, medical supplies reserved for officers while common soldiers suffered with untreated wounds. The wounded were often viewed as burdens, failures of the warrior spirit. Pain was something to be endured silently, medical comfort a sign of weakness. Nurses like Sachiko had been trained to see their patients as servants of the emperor first, human beings second. But these Americans treated every patient, Japanese or American, officer or private, ally or former enemy, with identical care and attention. They wasted nothing, yet they seemed to have endless supplies. They worked with machine-like efficiency, yet showed human warmth. They represented a conquering army, yet behaved like mercy missions. The abundance was not just material, but spiritual. Where Japanese military doctrine had preached that suffering built character and scarcity bred strength, the Americans seemed to believe that healing created strength and abundance enabled nobility. They shared not because they had to, but because they could. They helped not for strategic advantage, but because helping was what human beings did for other human beings. One moment crystallized this transformation for Sachiko. On the 3rd day of American occupation, she was working in the infectious disease ward when she discovered young Corporal Yamada burning with fever, his dysentery having progressed to the point where death seemed imminent. For weeks, she had been able to offer him nothing but cool cloths and words of comfort. Now she found herself looking at bottles of medicine that could actually save his life. But she hesitated. These were American supplies meant for American purposes. Surely they would not waste such precious resources on a dying Japanese soldier, a man who had likely killed Americans in combat. Captain Harrison appeared beside her, as if sensing her uncertainty. Without speaking, he prepared a dose of the new antibiotics and personally administered it to Corporal Yamada. Then he sat beside the bed for 20 minutes, monitoring the young soldier's vital signs with the same attention he would have given to his own troops. "Why?" Sachiko finally asked, the question that had been building in her heart for days. Harrison looked at her with those kind eyes that had first shocked her. "Because he's sick and we can make him well. Isn't that reason enough?" The simplicity of the answer revealed the complexity of what was happening. This was not occupation as conquest, but occupation as opportunity. The chance to demonstrate that victory need not mean vengeance, that strength could express itself through gentleness, that the most powerful nations were those secure enough to show mercy. Day by day, the sulfa packets became fewer, but their impact multiplied. Each dose administered was a small victory against the philosophical framework that had sustained the war. Each life saved was a testament to values that transcended national boundaries. Each act of medical kindness weakened the foundations of the militaristic ideology that had brought such devastation to the Pacific. Sachiko began to understand that she was witnessing something unprecedented in human history, a conquering army that sought not to dominate but to heal, not to exploit but to restore. The Americans had come to Japan with more than superior firepower. They had come with a superior philosophy, one that saw strength and abundance shared rather than hoarded, victory and healing rather than harming. The other nurses noticed the change in her, and through her began to experience their own transformations. Nurse Taniguchi, who had lost her brother at Guadalcanal, found herself working alongside the very Americans who might have killed him, yet discovered in them not monsters, but healers. Nurse Yoshida, who had been taught that American soldiers were barbarians driven by greed and violence, instead encountered men who sacrificed their own comfort to care for strangers and enemies. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. In those first weeks of occupation, the American medical units treated over 3,000 Japanese patients, performing hundreds of surgeries that would have been impossible without American supplies and expertise. They established field hospitals in bombed-out schools and temples, bringing modern medicine to communities that had been cut off from medical care for years. They trained Japanese medical personnel in new techniques, sharing knowledge that would save lives long after the occupation ended. More importantly, they demonstrated through daily actions that their concept of victory included the welfare of the defeated. This was not the zero-sum game of empire that Japan had practiced, where one nation's gain required another's loss. This was something entirely different. A vision of victory so secure in its own strength that it could afford to be generous, so confident in its values that it could demonstrate them through mercy rather than violence. The sulfa packets, with their simple yellow envelopes and life-saving contents, became the physical manifestation of this philosophical revolution. Each packet represented American industrial capacity, channeled toward healing rather than destruction. Each dose administered demonstrated American values made concrete in the most basic human terms, the relief of suffering and the preservation of life. But the transformation was not one-sided. As Sachiko worked alongside the American medics, she began to see her own culture through different eyes. The stoic acceptance of suffering that had been praised as virtue now seemed like unnecessary cruelty. The rigid hierarchies that had defined military medicine now appeared arbitrary and counterproductive. The notion that enemies could not become allies, that hatred was stronger than healing, that military victory required spiritual domination. All of these ideas crumbled in the face of daily evidence to the contrary. She found herself questioning not just military doctrine, but deeper cultural assumptions. If Americans could show such kindness to former enemies, what did that say about the nature of strength? If they could share their abundance so freely, what did that reveal about the relationship between power and generosity? If they could heal rather than harm, what possibilities existed for human relationships that transcended the brutal calculus of war? The answers came not through lectures or propaganda, but through the accumulation of small kindnesses. When Private Rodriguez taught her to use the new antibiotics, he was patient and encouraging, treating her not as a defeated enemy, but as a fellow medical professional. When Sergeant Murphy helped carry supplies to the upper floors, he worked alongside Japanese orderlies as equals, sharing jokes despite the language barrier. When Captain Harrison made his daily rounds, he checked on Japanese patients with the same thoroughness he showed American personnel. These interactions created cognitive dissonance that could not be resolved within the old framework of understanding. The Americans were supposed to be materialistic, but they gave away their materials freely. They were supposed to be individualistic, but they worked together with collective efficiency. They were supposed to be soft, but they had defeated the Japanese Empire through superior organization and technology. They were supposed to be vengeful, but they responded to defeat with offers of healing. The sulfa packets became, in this context, more than medicine. They became evidence of a different way of organizing human society, one based on abundance rather than scarcity, cooperation rather than competition, healing rather than harming. Each yellow envelope contained not just sulfanilamide, but a philosophy of prosperity that included former enemies, victory that strengthened rather than weakened the defeated, power that expressed itself through service rather than domination. As weeks passed into months, the transformation spread beyond the hospital walls. Japanese civilians, initially terrified of the American occupation, began to see the same pattern of generous behavior that had amazed the medical staff. Instead of the brutal conquest they had been promised by their own propaganda, they encountered occupiers who distributed food to the hungry, medicine to the sick, and hope to the despairing. The abundance was real and tangible. American supply ships arrived weekly, unloading not just military equipment but civilian relief supplies. Food, medicine, clothing, tools for reconstruction, all flowed into Japan with a generosity that defied Japanese understanding of how conquering armies behaved. This was not the limited sharing of emergency aid, but systematic provision of resources to rebuild a shattered nation. But more transformative than the material abundance was the philosophical abundance, the American belief that prosperity was not a zero-sum game, that one nation's success did not require another's failure, that former enemies could become future allies through demonstrated good faith and shared interests. The sulfa packets, now distributed throughout Japan's medical system, carried this message to every corner of the defeated empire. Each dose administered in a remote village hospital, each life saved in a bombed-out clinic, each infection cured in a refugee camp became testimony to the possibility of victory without vengeance, conquest without cruelty, occupation without oppression. Sachiko, now serving as a liaison between Japanese medical staff and American occupation forces, found herself at the center of this transformation, the young woman who had begun the war believing in Japanese superiority. Through spiritual discipline, now found herself learning from Americans who seemed to have achieved actual superiority, through material abundance guided by moral principles. The irony was not lost on her. Japan had gone to war partly to challenge what it saw as American and European domination of Asia, to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that would free Asian peoples from Western exploitation. Yet the reality of American occupation revealed exploitation to be precisely what was not happening. Instead, the Americans were investing their own resources in Japanese recovery, sharing their technology and knowledge, and preparing Japan for eventual independence and partnership rather than permanent subordination. The sulfa packets, in their simple effectiveness, became symbols of this larger reality. American industrial capacity, which had produced the ships and planes and tanks that had defeated Japan, was now producing medicine and food and tools for reconstruction. The same organizational efficiency that had coordinated successful amphibious assaults across the Pacific was now coordinating relief efforts throughout Japan. The same technological superiority that had manifested in radar and aviation was now improving Japanese hospitals and medical training. But perhaps most importantly, the same moral confidence that had sustained American forces through years of difficult warfare was now expressing itself through patient work to rebuild a former enemy into a future ally. This was not the behavior of a nation drunk on conquest, but of a nation secure in its values and generous in their application. As 1945 turned into 1946, and the first year of occupation drew to a close, Sachiko reflected on the journey she had traveled from that first morning, when American soldiers had walked into her hospital, carrying wooden crates instead of weapons. The woman who had measured rice grains with desperate precision now worked in a hospital supplied with more medicine than she had ever imagined possible. The nurse who had believed in Japanese spiritual superiority now collaborated daily with Americans who seemed to possess a different but equally powerful form of spiritual strength, one expressed through healing rather than harming, building rather than destroying, sharing rather than hoarding. The sulfa packets, now a common sight in Japanese hospitals throughout the occupied territories, had become more than symbols. They were instruments of transformation, each dose a small but measurable victory for the principles of abundance over scarcity, cooperation over competition, healing over harming. They represented American power, but power exercised through generosity rather than force, strength demonstrated through kindness rather than cruelty. The philosophical implications were staggering. If America could afford to be generous with former enemies, what did that suggest about the nature of true strength? If Americans could share their abundance without weakening themselves, what did that reveal about the relationship between prosperity and security? If they could turn enemies into allies through demonstrated good faith, what possibilities existed for international relationships based on mutual benefit rather than mutual suspicion? These questions echoed through Japanese society as the occupation continued. The answers, gradually emerging through daily experience rather than theoretical discussion, suggested that Japan had underestimated not just American military power, but American civilizational capacity, the ability to organize human society in ways that generated abundance rather than scarcity, cooperation rather than conflict, growth rather than stagnation. The sulfa packets, in their humble effectiveness, had opened a window into this possibility. Each yellow envelope contained not just medicine, but a glimpse of a different way of organizing human relationships, one based on the radical premise that helping others help themselves was the most secure foundation for one's own prosperity and security. As Sachiko administered the last sulfa packet from that first shipment to a young Japanese soldier whose life it would almost certainly save, she understood that she was participating in something unprecedented in human history. This was not just military occupation, but civilizational transformation, the peaceful transmission of values and practices that had the power to reshape not just Japan, but the entire international system. The abundance that had shocked her in those first days had become not just normal, but expected. More importantly, it had become understood, not as American extravagance, but as American wisdom. The nation that could afford to be generous with enemies had demonstrated a form of strength that transcended military victory. It had shown that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to heal, build, and transform. The sulfa packets were gone now, their contents administered to patients who would live because of American generosity and Japanese medical skill working in partnership. But their lesson remained, embedded in the institutional relationships and personal friendships that had developed during those first crucial months of occupation. Japan would rebuild, not as a conquered territory locked in permanent subordination, but as an ally prepared to participate in a new kind of international system, one based on the revolutionary premise that former enemies could become future partners, that victory could strengthen rather than weaken the defeated, that abundance shared was abundance multiplied. The yellow envelopes had contained more than medicine. They had contained a vision of human possibility that would reshape the Pacific, influence the Cold War, and demonstrate to the world that military victory, when guided by moral purpose and expressed through generous action, could achieve something unprecedented in human history: the transformation of enemies into allies through the simple but revolutionary act of sharing abundance in the service of healing. In the end, the Japanese nurses had been stunned, not just by American medical supplies, but by American values made manifest in the most concrete possible terms: the saving of lives, the relief of suffering, and the demonstration that true strength lay not in the capacity to harm, but in the courage to heal. Word count approximately 6,000 words.